by this. Because it's so posh also, but you can see only someone that sees a lakus would answer this. What would you answer? Like, such a klotzkash. The Rebbe's answer is like this: why do you need Talmud in general? Why do you need to learn? Because we don't naturally sense what's right. So you don't know what to do. Come Shabbos, you have to learn what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do. But if we were aligned with what the Ratzon Hashem, we wouldn't need Talmud. So, like for example, the Rebbe gives this example. You don't have to open a Shulchan Aruch to know that you have to eat in the morning, because your body tells you have to eat, to breathe, to drink, etc. But we live in a world where they're able to conceal the fact that your neshama needs. So therefore, you need to learn to tell you what your neshama needs, and then hopefully you train yourself to become more aligned and so on. L'asad lavei, the material world will be so saturated with Ratzon Elyon, just like the body feels hunger, the soul will know what to do. It doesn't have to need Talmud. That's why Maisa got. And what you'll need Talmud then is in order to reach deeper in God's mind and understand the Eibishter, but not in order to know what to do, what not to do. Isn't that like, it's maybe, I know. No, because the Rebbe brings the medrash that says, lovely, that when you'll try to rip off a fruit from a tree, a Shabbos or a Shemitah, the fruit will tell you, it's Shemitah today, or Shabbos today. It's an Evan Mekir Tizak, that the stone in the wall will cry out. As they say, the stones absorb everything.
Bulach.
Right, exactly. So bottom line is, in other words, that's when the Keli is completely aligned with the Eir. So when they say the difference between Rabbi Hillel, Parasher, and the Alter Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe would fall asleep before Shabbos, Rabbi Hillel, Parasher would go to sleep. But because the Alter Rebbe was aligned with the Dormita de Zah, that Zah went into a type of comatose state, went into a trance or whatever, a slumber, and the Rabbi Hillel knew what it says, so he went and did it, and the Alter Rebbe didn't need to, just sensed it and just that's what happened. And the Alter Rebbe also, when he was in prison, he knew when was day and when was night. He knew the hours based on the tzurufim, it says. I mean, look, it's not that magical if you think about it. If someone's truly sensitive to what is going on, to the vibes, they just are aligned to it, are aligned. Anybody here achieving these levels of sensitivity? Oh no, the truth is, no, by the way, subtly speaking, all of us have examples of it, in certain intuitions, certain vibes. If you're trained, you could see somebody's, I'm sure people come to you, some things you could just see in their face, something, I'm not saying you're going to have a diagnosis, but with experience, you could sense a vibe, you can sense an energy. Obviously you want to make sure, and stuff like that. When they asked the students in Tavshan Chav, there was a group of college students who were by the Rebbe in Yechidus. So their last question was, can the Rebbe do miracles? You know that one? Yeah. So I found it actually before my son's bar mitzvah, and we published it because the Rebbe's edits. So they asked the Rebbe whether he can do miracles. So the Rebbe said, not everything they say about me you have to believe, something like that. But then he said, but you have to understand that a miracle is simply, if you understand the physical universe, it's just the outer layer of energy. So someone who can go into the engineering room and rewire it, so it's natural. They rewire the energy, so the physical thing changes. That was the Rebbe's answer. It's not a big thing. You just have to. The problem is nobody can go into that room. Nobody knows how to go there. But so then the Rebbe said to them, so if I inspire you tonight that each of you leaving here will do a mitzvah, a good deed, I will have performed a miracle. When he edit, I will have performed a miracle. Because in other words, he inspired them, they actually go ahead and do something. The function. And then the Rebbe, when he edited, he changed, I will have performed a miracle, he changed it to we will have performed a miracle. But he did say I. In that same Yechidus, the students asked the Rebbe, the non-Jews have a soul. And Dr. Black told this to me. He was in with them. And the Rebbe, they said, because Dr. Black told them that non-Jews don't have a soul. And Dr. Black was standing there, and the Rebbe says to the students, you can tell Dr. Black that he's wrong. And then he went on, he said that they have a divine spark. It's different than the soul of a Jew, but they have a divine. Nothing cannot have a divine. And then he went on. He said that. Black told me. He told me. He said in the published thing they didn't put that part in. That Dr. Black is wrong. But he told me that the Rebbe said to tell Dr. Black that he was wrong.
According to Tanya, they have nefesh sichlis and no nefesh elokas.
Not for discussion now. First of all, they're born. What about how could it be a stated to the Mishnah says Chaviv Adam Shenivru V'Tzalam Tzalam Elokim. That's on the shaman. Vayipak Ba'apah Mishmas Chaim says on Adam, which is every human being. So you have to understand the Tanya. It's not so simple.
Mm-hmm.
The Tanya Taka says that on the shaman. The answer is that they have. That also the Rebbe brings from Kehelis. It says Ruach HaAdam Eilu L'Mayla, V'Ruach HaBehema Yeredus L'Mata. They have to say they have some type of nefesh and neshama. It's not the way we usually just dismiss it as that. The question is what kind of neshama. Then it says also. And it says in the Mishnah, I know this subject very well. I did a lot of research on it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll show you if you want the Likutei Sichos Chelik. You have a Likutei Sichos here?
Yeah.
Chelik Yud Gimel? Can you bring me one?
Yeah. I can give you one.
But to read the name? Doesn't need a handful. Anyway, so I'll show you. There's a beautiful letter from the Rebbe. He talks about the selling. So it says in the Tasters that Yesh Eitzah Shanikra Guf, that where the Eitzah of Neshamas of non-Jews are. There's definitely a Neshama part. Is it the Nefesh Elikis and Tanya? Obviously not, but it has elements of it, and it's a longer discussion. I'll show it to you. I can tell you this. When I did the research on Torah Meaning for Life, I needed to have the answer to this. And I found some tremendous things from the Rebbe that I didn't recall until I needed it.
Yeah, anything written?
Yeah. I don't know if I've written on this, but I could tell you. Well, first start with this. There's this. It's a Ha'aris of the Rebbe, Sef Hilchos Shmita V'Yevul from the Rambam. So he talks Kol Ish V'ish.
What page is it?
Page 230 and all the footnotes. Chelik Yud Gimel. So he brings here that every person, if he chooses, can be like a Kohen Gadol. The one where he says, not Shevet Levi alone, but everyone can be like Shevet Levi, and even a Kohen Gadol that goes into the Beis HaMikdash. And the Rebbe says, Kol Ish V'ish means also non-Jews, and he gives whole full footnotes to explain it. And I think that in Yeshiva, and all of us, we're not taught properly the approach of the Rebbe to non-Jews. And it's not a contradiction to what was before, but you have to remember, like the Rebbe said in the early 80s, we spoke about Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Neach. I mean, it's not relevant to this discussion. Maybe Primis HaKerem, Chetzemis HaKerem, I don't know. Is that the Rebbe said, so why, the Rebbe is talking about everyone, fulfilling the Rambam's halacha, that it's a mitzvah on a Jew to influence a non-Jew to do Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Neach. So the Rebbe said, so how come no one ever did it? That was the big question everybody was asking. And I remember hours, Pesach, Mem Beis, Mem Gimel, Mem Daled, Mem Hey, 3 years. For Pesach was a long Fabrein, Shavuos, Pesach and Shavuos especially. Hours the Rebbe spoke about this. And you could see how vital it was. And the Rebbe's basic answer was, he said a lot of things, but one thing he said was, it was never possible in history. Jews never had the capacity to do that. Since the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, we were always on the defense, and it would have been dangerous. Go around, when you can start talking to the Christians in Europe who are killing you. Listen, Shem Mitzvah B'nai Neach. That's what the Rebbe said. The times changed.
Did they do it when it was a Beis HaMikdash?
Beis HaMikdash, they didn't have to do with non-Jews. They were alone in Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, Shlomo HaMelech did it when he met Baal Kashva. The few times he had. Avram Avinu did it. But you don't have in history real opportunities. There was never a place where Jews had the freedom to do it, and they were together with non-Jews. When Jews lived in shtetls, it wasn't practical. Which means, and the Rebbe explained there, that it's not just a change of time, it's also the refinement of the nation. When you say the world has become refined, we mean the non-Jews have become refined. The fact that there's a country like the United States, and today most countries, at least in the West, have basic freedom values, rights, and so on, which is Torah values, is a phenomenon that's only 200-300 years old. So it's a big topic of the Rebbe's approach. Since we're on it already, I'll just remember one thing that I saw right away. The Rebbe was absolutely revolutionary with this thing. And it's connected to Mashiach. Because if you don't say that all the non-Jews are capable of being Chassidim Misaelim today, what does it mean the world is ready? What world? There's 7 billion people on earth. Without a miracle. So the only answer is that these 7 billion are ready. and they're receptive. And you don't need a miracle. And they were not receptive 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, they didn't embrace these values. In other words, the values of Torah values exist today. We're not talking about individually. Individually, Jews also have plenty to do. But collectively, there is that spirit exists. I remember it was Tavshin. Yeah, it was Mishpatim Tavshin Mendaled, and the Rebbe said in a Fabrengen, in the middle of nowhere, they said he was speaking about Mashiach coming, and that the whole world will be refined. Molar's Deus Hashem, and Lo Yeh Kol Elam El Das Hashem. And the Rebbe says, and you see, we're getting closer to it, and you can see that people are more receptive. That idea. And then suddenly the Rebbe said, and can move on, that we can immediately go from this stage to that stage, with the Gula. And it doesn't require any miracle or something, and it doesn't require anyone should die, or any wars, or anyone should get killed. Because obviously the Jews are not going to have to be killed. So he's basically negating the apocalypse, or type of Gog and Magog or something. Like there'll have to be a war to wipe out all the non-believers. Now listen, but he said that expression that non-Jews will not have to die or be killed. So I wrote in right away Sunday, I remember, the Gemara says, the Charker B'nai Sheis, there's two opinions, whether 2/3 of the world is going to be killed when Mashiach comes, or 2/3 of 2/3. It's two. One means Charker B'nai Sheis. It's calculation. But however you twist it, it says that they will be. And it was one of those questions I was extremely intrigued what the Rebbe was going to say to this. Because it's like a Gemara, that he basically, you can't disagree with the Gemara, right? So the Rebbe wrote back that Yeduber b'zeh mitzvah Hashem Shabbos HaKedesh Haba. When the Rebbe had a lot to say, he wouldn't answer in writing. He would say, "I'm going to speak about it in mitzvah Hashem next Shabbos." So we knew there was a. And by the way, the Rebbe would plant things like this all the time. The Rebbe said many times. I especially said something in the Fabrengen that was a contradiction, and 18 years it took someone to realize that. He said that many times.
So what did he
Not
say
many.
about himself?
So there was a lot of things like that we knew. I always knew in Sichos, it was the Rebbe. Biggest chidushim of the Rebbe, Chassidus, and Nigla all came from questions. The Rebbe said something, and someone noticed it's a little different, and then asked, and then the Rebbe let loose. It was almost always that way. Very rarely. I mean, there are times, but a lot. So the Rebbe next Shabbos, he said, I was asked about the Gemara, so not everyone knew what the Rebbe meant, and I said that people, no one's going to die, and the Gemara says that, and the Rebbe, I'll never forget how the Rebbe responded. He said, he always, said, and the people who asked the question didn't even realize that the question is not on what I said, the question is on the Gemara. So the Rebbe said, he said that. He said they never. He used to demand, like we were supposed to really, not understand. That's what the Rebbe expected from us. And why? Because it says a feish pasuk. Rachem. I remember the Rebbe saying, "Rachem Hashem al kol ma'asav." Hashem has compassion on all His creatures. How could it be that He's going to go kill His creatures? That was the Rebbe. And I remember. I'll tell you the beer in a minute. It's printed now in the Kuntei Sichos Chelik Chav Gimel. Bolak. Chav Gimel. Bolak. That Sikha, you'll see, Mishpat and Trum and Memdal, that came from this answer. And the Rebbe said, but the fact that he asked such a question on the Gemara, that meant by him that it's not even possible to translate the Gemara Kipshuta. He was not accepting that. That means it wasn't just a line that he said. In other words, you can't say that so I realized that the Rebbe has it's a philosophical issue here. It's not just a technicality, that the world is not going to be destroyed, and the non-Jewish world included. Which you tell me what it says. It says that the Rebbe looks, most of us would say, hey, the non-Jews, after what they did to us, they deserve to all be killed. Well, let a few guys, the guys that were saved some Jews in the Holocaust, to stay around. I mean, this is common talk, publicized, right? But it's not true. It's simply not true. And the Rebbe's answer was, he went through a whole discussion. First he answered that maybe the pshat is that they won't die, but they won't give birth, so they'll die out. So it won't be an act of killing them. But the Rebbe said even that's not acceptable, because why would God give people power to give birth and then not take it away from them? And the Rebbe's answer is quite simple actually. The Rebbe says it doesn't say the word death. It says the word keloyin, vayechulu. Keloyin is bittul. They're going to change, the tsura on their mitzias will change. So compared, like we say, man de nofel, when we say a chassan even. You say, man the nofel medaga ikra mis. Someone that's not up to the level that he should be. Basically, in other words, a metamorphosis that is fundamental is like the death of that stage to get to another stage.
And why only 2/3?
Right, no question too.
No, because not everybody will need to go through that sort of change, like that.
That's somewhere.
I mean, lahavdil,
Already.
when the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe became Rebbe, so he had right away typhus. He had a very serious typhus fever, and it was it was really life threatening. The famous line then that he spoke, and one of the Chassidim said the Rebbe, told the doctors, don't mind him, he's just speaking from hits.
He's delirious.
He's like delirious, right? He's speaking from fever. So the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe later said to him, he heard. Friedrich Rebbe says, mainly that you said it on me, but you said it on the son of the Rebbe. There was that you say it to the son of my father, in other words. But then the Rogatchover wrote a letter to Chassidim that they shouldn't be concerned, because al pi halacha, when a chassid becomes a Rebbe, since he was a son, now he's becoming a Rebbe, he's becoming a new Metzias, and al pi halacha, he become a new Metzias through libum, through a high fever, and that's like a kasher and oven, you have to make it till it's white hot.
Wow.
That's what he writes. So the Rebbe became a new Metzias, so you had to go through this so-called like cleansing, or whatever you want to call it, heating.
What did he say?
Who?
What did the Friedrich Rebbe say?
To this?
When he was in
When
that
he was
state.
in
I don't know.
his delirious state.
I don't know. Well, I know the one thing. In the Shkafta the Rebbe Berel Rifkin writes that when the Rebbe Rashab was in a state like that, I can tell you what he writes what he said. As an neshama gate ace from the Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata. And the neshama expires from the unity of Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata. That's what the Rebbe Rashab said in the middle of his sleep, the last night of his life. It's unbelievable. That's what Rebbes say when they're delirious, I guess. If you kavyochel delirious, whatever. Look, Zalman Moshe said when the Friedrich Rebbe had the stroke, he was in Paris, I think, he said, look how grub the world is, we can't even understand what the Rebbe is saying. The problem was with us, not with the Rebbe. Like Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, L'mayla medibur.
Explain it again. As the Shama gate is, when the Yichud,
Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata. That's what
that existence over here is in a state of Yichud, and departure from existence is exiting the state of Yichud?
No. The unity of Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata is causing the neshama to...
Neshama's recognition of that, maybe.
Yeah.
He sees that.
It's like reaching a place that's beyond... That's what he said. I mean, I don't know if any of you have never read Ashkafta the Rebbe. It's in Hebrew, but it's easy to read. It's easy. It's beyond words. You have to read. Berel Rifkin was he lived in, he was close to the Rabbi. He was here. I don't know if any of you remember him. Were you here when he passed away? Berel Rifkin.
Behind the Rebbe.
Yeah. Moshe Berel Rifkin. He was a chazer. He was.
He lived right here, 706 is the park.
Right.
So anyway, so he wrote a diary of everything that happened the last week or two from the Rebbe Rashab's life. It's mind blowing. First of all, he's a big scholar, so he writes it with footnotes of the details of halachas, how he washed negelvasser, how he made brachas. Even when he was like completely incapacitated, it was just, and then that's where the famous line is. Where the Rebbe Rashab asked him to take his bed into the Beis Medrash, into the Zal. And he says, Ich gehe in Himmel, and the Ksovim lazachayich. So he writes all about that. I'm going to heaven, and the Ksovim I leave to you. And then Friedrich Rebbe started crying. Became very emotional. So his father looked at him and said, his spilus, moichin. And from that moment on, Rivka writes, they couldn't see anything on the Rebbe, on Friedrich Rebbe. Then how he describes the last minutes, it's heartbreaking. He writes it well, like a knowledgeable person. It's not just writing, not sensational. It's very, and then the Rebbe Rashab, how he asks for things, this, what he says. I think it's the last night. He hears him speaking in his sleep. He's like very high fever. It's a fascinating thing to read, very powerful. Ashkafta the Rebbe, it's called. With a lot of footnotes, a lot of all the nigla. It's amazing. I can't say it's hard to even imagine how the Rebbe Rashab was. Every move was like b'diuk pi halacha. It's unbelievable. Even like, he was learning things from him and he asked to bring a Shulchan Aruch. I mean, he had, it's like, it's a document that's well worth reading. You ever read it? You never subscribed to them? It's something to read. Yeah.
There's another diary that's just surfaced also about the last moments.
Volkan.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Is
is
it
there also just last?
similar?
Yeah, they're just printed in the book.
What book is this?
I should be the one who was still in the...
Yeah, this is, the board of staff, this is.
So let's continue on.
So in the Gemara it uses Kilion, that word?
That's the Gemara, yeah.
Which Gemara is that?
It's in Sanhedrin, I think, Daf Nun or something. I'm not, look at Chelik of Gimel, I think it's Daf Nun something or other. After you bring this message to many people, hopefully.
Amen.
Like the Rebbe, stick it into every little thing and it'll help the situation.
So the answer the Rabbi gave was in the next week after Mishpatim?
Yeah, Truma.
In Truma.
Mandal, yeah.
And it's brought down in the Sikhs?
Maybe it's Mem Gimel, now that I'm, Mem Gimel, not Mandal, sorry, Mem Gimel.
Mem Gimel?
Ilkut Sikhs Chelik of Gimel, Parsha Bolok.
Chaf Gimel?
Parsha Bolok, and at the end of the Sikh it will say, Mishpatim Truma, Mem Gimel. You want to bring the Chelik of Gimel?
What's in
Listen. How can you have unbelievable potential?
What part?
Parsha, this is Yud Gimel. It's Parsha Mishpatim and Truma.
Yes. No, what topic was it?
The thing about the Gemara, that the Goyim.
Oh, I thought that was Haf Gimel Bubbles.
You guys see him calling? Oh, he's on his plane.
So what was in Haf Gimel Bubbles?
About this thing, Charka B'nai Sheis, about 2/3 of the world.
And it's continued later, not Mem Gimel.
No, Mem Gimel's when the Rebbe spoke about it. Tavshin Mem Gimel.
But when the Rabbi answered that Rachmanis, the Abishah had the questions on the Gemara, not on what he says, because the Abishah has Rachmanis on his kinder, whether it's Jewish or not.
Maisiv, it says on his creation.
So the Shaila is, but then what about the Mabul?
Yeah, but the past, all the stuff that happened.
The Mabul is the bigger Shaila on it. What that whole mankind?
So, I'm sure if you think about it, you'll come up with an answer. I don't even think that's in a footnote there. Remember the Mabul, God first of all promised he'll never do another Mabul. And it's a legitimate question, but you have to review it, The Chumash itself asked the question, why did he create them in the first place? Then he regretted it, Nachem al kol, the end of Parsha Bereshis. In general, I would say the Mabul is an exception in general because of it's a one-time thing, and there was a whole different story there.
And the rest of history was so nice.
Yeah, I know, that's awesome.
Well, something, the questions are legitimate. I'm not dismissing the question, but at the end of the day, no matter what, the Rebbe said what he said, which means that today he does not feel it's that way. That's clear. And especially, remember the Rebbe seeing that the world is ready for Mashiach and Gula, clearly knows a Mabul is not coming. So there's that. So technically, the question is a correct one. How did the Eibishter not have Rachmanis then and stuff like that? That needs an answer. But it's definitely not applicable to where we are today. I have to think about it, but let's all think about it. Let's see what we can come up with. Learn the Sikha. Maybe there is something there that Bavar. I don't recall. So let's continue on. I'm going to continue the next mimer.
Yeah.
I'm going to start from top of page Tovkuf Pei Aleph,
When you say
581.
When you said earlier about Pia now, when you said that there's a flow, you wrote 100 pages straight, and then.
Like for example, here the mimer, the paragraph that ends as Etzem on page
Yes.
Tovkuf Ayin Test 579, in the handwriting of the Rebbe Rashab would go straight to chapter V'hinei on page 581, and every mimer goes like that.
How do you, the Kitzur I can understand, wherever you wrote Kitzur, you say he wrote the Kitzur's
Later, but also this.
How would you understand, how would you know that about about Pia now?
No, I know because all the beginnings and ends he also wrote later in a different book. The beginnings and ends of every mimer were not written when he wrote the flow. I mean, I know that. First of all, go to the back. They have a description of the whole, how it was written.
So whenever you see Baal Piyah now.
No. The whole thing is like this. Every beginning and end on the Psukim came later. You could rest assured of that. You understand what I'm saying? Everything. Every mimer begins with a pasuk. Elam Maseh Bereshis. This is those beginnings and those ends all came later. So everything else is one long flow. Except in maybe 2-3 exceptions.
Here he's discussing the beginning. So that comes later. It's related to when he wrote about the Eschana.
Okay, here it is. Page 236 here.
In what book?
They give it on the Pashas. I know it from the volumes, Chelik Chav Gimel. This is not Chelik Chav Gimel.
But
This
it
is on
shows
the
you that
Pashas.
it shows you
Yeah. I just used the other one. So, it's chapter, Chelik Chav Gimel, pages 172 to 181. And the Sikh is, like I said, B'shalach and Mishpatim Mem Gimel. Not B'shalach and Mishpatim, I mean, Shalach was what he said first, and then Mem Gimel. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, if you hadn't asked that question, we wouldn't have had that answer.
I could tell you hundreds of other things that we wouldn't have had. No, maybe the Rebbe would have said it at some point himself, but probably not. Yeah, and you had to catch that one line. It was just a half a line. The Rebbe just said, "They're going moving, they're not going to die," something like that. Who would? I mean, I happen to know the Gemara. You a line like that. Okay, they won't die. Why should it bother? It's not just that. If you look at all the Sikhs, first of all, over all the years, I found things in the years in the 50s about Gula Mashiach that you only can understand later. Rebbe already was talking. So, but as it got in the 80s, when you start talking a lot about Shem Mizvrenech, there's no question when you really learn, you get a different perspective on how you look at the world, and how you look at non-Jews, and how you look at the stage, so to speak. And there's no way to really get there without really reading those sikhs, But if I we talked about learning in Yoni Gula Mashiach, to me, obviously learning all those sikhs of the mems is critical, even like a sikh like this. Because to make it palatable, you have to understand how is it going to play itself out. Some things are mysteries we're not going to know until it happens. But how is it palatable? Someone asks a simple question: 7 billion people are going to change. Most of them are selfish, including ourselves. So exactly how is this going to happen? B'derech hateva. We all understand it can happen from above. So the only way to answer that is learning these sikhs, learning chassidus. That elikus could become part of our lives. I mean, this is you learn that chetzenis hakeli could be a primis hakeli could be a keli to the air. You're learning how we can become kelim to something that's higher than us. That to me is the way we get there. Okay, so I'm going to start Ulahavin Kol Zeh. So again, the beginning and end of every mimer was written later. And in it, when he wrote the beginning, he wrote always Ulahavin Kol Zeh to understand. I'm on top of line 1, 581.
Right.
So he's continuing. This is going to be a good summary of the last mimer. To understand the fusion. First line on Tav Kuf Pei Aleph.
Middle of the line.
Okay.
To understand this chabrus. I'm sorry. We're going to preface by saying.
Ended early, right today. Etzem, you're saying it was Rebbe went right to Lahavi?
No, he went to Vihine. But
But
but this is a summary of everything, so I thought it's good to review. So he says, "Be'in hischabrus ha'er va'akeli." And I want to qualify again. I'm not saying I'm giving a license that you should skip.
Yeah.
It's just that here they've been learning it, so I could always do this later. So I decided to just keep the flow going. So yes, we'll preface what we discussed earlier in the Inyan of the fusion of the Eid and Keli, of the energy in the container. This is a summary of the whole. The Etzem Mahusam, fundamentally, they're opposites of one another. The air be'etzem muhuseh hu b'chinas ayin. Air, by its personality, its essential nature, its muhus, is ayin. It's nothingness. It's not yesh. The only way we could understand ayin is by understanding process of elimination. It's not a yesh like we understand the yesh. It's ayin. It's no substance. That's ayin. V'yesh b'teva aliyah. And it has the nature of transcendence, of going upwards. Liyah is b'chinas ayin b'yeser. To become even more ayin. So it's not just ayin, it's always gravitating, opposite of gravitating, ungravitating, to even a deeper ayin. And we learned the 3 different levels of air, 3 different types of bitla and ayin, because it senses its source. So it reflects its source, it senses its source, and it wants to be concluded, encompassed in the source. V'akeli is the opposite. Hu b'chinas yesh, hu mitzias be'etzem muhusa. And he emphasizes be'etzem muhusa. This isn't circumstantial, it's not incidental. Ayir be'etzem is ayin and wants more ayin. Akeli be'etzem is yesh and wants more yesh. Akeli b'chinas yesh, hu mitzias be'etzem. Generally speaking, the difference between yesh and mitzias. Mitzias means substance, and yesh means
entity.
More than substance. But yesh is already a sense of self, I would say. Yesh is more than mitzias.
Self-awareness.
Consciousness. Mitzias be'etzem uhusa, hu b'teva yerida. And its nature is the opposite, it's to go down, instead of going up. Finis bo'er, and we explained. Keli. Finis bo'er, and we explained the ischaber shalom. So how do the 2 unite? How could 2 opposites unite? So we explained that this is chapter Reish Pei Daled, before Primis and Chetzenis Kelim. He explained in 284 that this happens because each of them have the other. This by this chaber shalahem, their fusion, their joining, their union. Hu ayidei sha'er v'akeli machlifim tivam. That's because the air, the energy, and the container replace each other's nature. Is that what we said, machlifim?
I think we said that there's something in the keli.
They exchange personalities. What?
No, there's a quality in the keli that has something of air.
Yeah, but he also used both expressions. That they the kolach of echad poel pu'ula zulasei ha'hofchi. Each of them, meaning air and keli, each of them behaves like the other that's opposite it. So keli behaves like an air, and the air behaves like a keli. Which really means, yes, it means that the keli has an element in it. But first step is that they both assume a shtickle personality, a part of the personality of the other.
Do we have any
What triggers
physicists
that?
in the room?
What triggers that?
First of all, the kavanah al-yemen, the fact they both sense the purpose.
Okay.
That's one thing. The second thing that triggers it, this is what we're learning. That's why Pimi said. But 1 second, look how the Rebbe Rashab says an interesting, he got a very rare language that he
Here's
uses.
the question, because you've probably been there before. Does this relate at all to light being both wave and particle? I don't know. I mean, I don't know physics enough.
No, it definitely relates, but I want to just say this. If you really, to be honest, this is far more sophisticated than physics, wave and particle. At this point, physics, I'm sure, will get more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Wave and particle is even though it's a big chiddush, but relatively it's a child's play compared to what he says here. Because, you see, wave and particle is how human beings figured out, through experimentation, they figured out something on a quantum level. Here, he's talking about levels that are pre-quantum,
Right.
and how they become quantum, and then they become tangible.
Just from the perspective of
Instead, so it's a whole different. Well, no, I just want to say this. I want to say another thing that's very important is the wave particle concept definitely fits, but wave particle, I would say, more precise is when he talks about whether energy whether energy itself has particles in it or not. Because air itself, there's the 2 opinions. Does air have tzir or air doesn't have tzir? So I think wave and particle more accurately is talking about light in physics. It's not talking about the containers. But remember, on a spiritual level, containers, as we spoke, is relatively also light.
But just
but I just want to say, if you really break it down, it's in the energy itself, the 2.
But here we're talking about an aspect of
We're
ore.
aligned?
I mean, we're talking about an aspect of ore which has a characteristic, or the ability for a characteristic of a keli.
Of a what?
He just said it.
Right? Each one contains a characteristic
No,
of the
excellent,
other.
excellent. But remember, Okay, I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, you got it.
No. So, Mike, but I have to remember that once the map is all laid out, Eir has many other elements. There's, for example, an expression "Meisavus Eir Nasa Keli," that Eir has a certain element of thickness, mass, particles, that which will create the container. So, at the end of the day, when the interface is complete, it was only one piece of it. Eir has many ways that it's let's put it this way, assimilates with the
So
Kalim.
this is very
And
simple.
Kalim have many ways that assimilate with
Is
Eir.
that aspect that the ore has fit this lotion, that there's a part of a ore which it can be machlif tevon, we call it
I would say not
You'd say
at
not.
this point.
Okay.
At this part of the interface. In other parts, yes. I'll tell you why I would say not. Because the examples he gave earlier, let's use the examples. He gave 3 examples. He gave the example of a seed decomposing. So the tchech hatzmich is the air, the power of growth in earth. The power of growth manifests in the seed. So I don't know if wave particle really works there. The second example he gave was what was the second example he gave? Oh, with fire and wick. That the wick is the keli, so the fire has to somewhere exchange. The lower part of the fire somewhat has to be conducive to the wick, and the wick has to be conducive to the. So it's a little more tangible than it is with wave and particle. That's the only reason I wouldn't say it in this, because here we're talking really more of how, let's put it this, how air in its highest level is very subtle. As it gets closer to the keli, it starts assuming keli properties. The keli on its lowest level is very grub, very yesh. As it gets closer to the air, it gets very subtle, and that's where they meet. That's where the interface happens. So think of it this way: you can't light a flame from a piece of metal won't burn. You need a wick. You need oil. So though wick and oil by personality is yesh, but it's already a refined yesh. That's a container for a flame. So I think here you're dealing more as almost like the keli sheba air and the air sheba keli. In general, the wave particle works. If it helps, you understand it. I'm just being very more precise because I would define it more when he speaks about how in energy itself there's 2 levels. Here he's speaking more about how air and keli. Remember, the contrast is going to be tohu, where air and keli do not have a symbiotic relationship. They cannot join. Think of it like a wick that's wet. So the flame keeps jumping and keeps sparking and will not catch.
Didn't you learn that in the earth itself is part of the keli?
That's what we're talking about now. Yeah. So anyway, this is a summary of that. So he says, so machlif, each one of them assumes the personality of the opposite. What does that mean? That the kelim, the containers which are yesh, and their teva is yirida, to go down, harihem pelim pu'ulas harihem pelim pu'ula hafchim liyaz b'chim. Why is it hafchim? It's hafchis. Harihem pelim pu'ula hafchim liyaz b'chim saliyo bitl dainam yesh la'ayin. So the keli assumes the identity from yesh. It's doing the opposite. Instead of going downward, it's receptive to the energy. So that already makes it. Let's put it this way: if a keli didn't have that ability, you don't have to force it. How would the keli be a container to? So the keli has to somewhat assume an element where it is going against its nature to receive that which is above it, beyond it. And the same is the other way around. Ayin, and the air whose ayin, nothingness or selflessness or substanceless. Harihu peil pula sahafchi. See there he says pula hafchim. Harihu peil pula sahafchi liyisma ayin liyesh. And the energy, instead of going upward and continuing to go into oblivion, in some way behaves with the properties of going from ayin to yesh. So like when the flame meets the wick has risen somewhat to the level of the flame, and the flame has descended somewhat to the level of the wick, and they join. That's it. But here's what it says. And that's how they join and unite one another. But here's a lesson that you don't really see. You ever saw that lesson? And to understand this, so basically, the whole reason we're going to primis and the outer and inner kelim is a havana in this concept of their meeting. Because the question now is, how do they meet? If a keli by nature it's into itself, and goes downward, and the Eir by nature is Ayin and upward, how do they meet? So good, yes, they feel the kavanah. We're going to learn all that, but he's trying to understand it as much as possible in terms that we can relate to. Because the interface, remember again, cannot be miraculous. It has to work on our terms. It has to be in a way that we can relate to. So to understand this union, where Keli, where air meets Keli, where substance meets selflessness, where the self meets selflessness, to understand that we have to, he says, this Bayar Agdama, he explained in the introduction, Shabbat that there's two levels in the Kelim, Primis HaKeli and Chitzenis HaKeli. The Primis HaKeli is Etzem Mahus HaKeli. The inner part of the Keli is the real essence of the container. Mashi Klei Kabbalah. What is that? That it's a container to receive. Like he said about the cup. The cup holds the wine or the liquid. The fact that you can drink from it, the fact that you can pour from it, that's its function. It's not the essence of it's not defining the Keli. Defining the Keli's container's function is not defining the Keli itself. So the Keli itself, however, is closer to the energy, to the light. And the outer part of the container, that's where you're talking about its effect, its transmission, it's what it reveals. So the first one, it describes the energy, meaning it's essentially a container for the energy. It's not about what its function is. And the Shema Kini V'Apula, as we said, here he really more or less includes them both as one. The functional name is the Chitzenis. The Shema Teir Hu Shematayr Megalas Etzem Ha'er. The descriptive name describes and reveals the essence of the energy. V'Shema Pa'ula, and the functional name Hu Shapel Chutz La'etzem, is how it functions and affects outside of the essence. V'Hu Pa'ulas Ha'isavus Hu Pa'ulas Ha'er V'Agili. This is already the function of creating and bringing things into being, and the function of revealing and Eir and Gili. Okay, so that's a summary. So this he wrote what the Rebbe Rashab wrote when he wrote the beginning of this Maimer, just to keep the flow going. And now Vehine is really that continues from where he left off. That's the.
What he just wrote, he wrote at a different time than the other.
Yeah, yes, it could be months. It could be sometimes even a year. I don't know exactly the timing, but it was a while.
What makes the Keli, when you say that the higher part of the Keli has more shaykhs to the or you could say the lower part of the has more shaykhs to the Keli. What makes the Keli have a higher part and what makes the have a lower part? Where do they lose their consistency?
What you're asking is really the development of the whole theme here. I can just tell you how, as I see it up till now. Remember that everything starts in Atzmus, where everything is one. He said that earlier as a whole introduction where he spoke about everything is there. The problem is, from Atzmus' point of view, we have no way of retracing the steps. That's Atzmus. So we have to have a way. So now Atzmus, which is beyond, has the power of Gvul, the power of Bli Gvul, the power to create Keli, the power to create etc., etc. We got that.
Yeah.
Now we have a structure called existence. We're all the way at the other end of the spectrum. We're at the receiving end. We don't even, we're trying to get from here to there.
Okay.
So in between there's this big Seder Shtalshel, so big structure. Big structure to us looks very, very fragmented. It looks compartmentalized. This is a Neir, this is a Keli. But we're going to end up learning that Eir and Keli in the root become one. But how do we become one? So all this is, I'm just qualifying, all this is explaining it. So when you ask me the question, you have to ask it, I assume you're asking it from our perspective.
Yeah.
So ultimately it's going to come down to that the Keli senses the Kavanah and the Eir senses the Kavanah, that's for sure. But that's not enough here. We have to find their personalities, because you say, okay, fine, they sense the Kavanah, but how do I work on it? How do I make my Keli more receptive to the Eir? That's really the question. I mean, you didn't say it that way, but I would phrase it. And the answer is that first you have to understand that you have a primis achitzenis. I think before you came, I told the thing with the Rebbe, was told the beauty queen from Israel.
I know the story.
Yeah. So basically, we have the first thing is look at a person, not just what you see their function, but to see what they really are. Once you get to that, you begin to perceive their neshama and their Eir. So basically, what you're doing here is you go from chitzenis hakeli to primis hakeli, that the primis hakeli becomes more receptive to the Eir. So The answer is going to be is that there's always a point where you need the etzem to bring them mamash together, but they can do a lot to get closer to it. You could have Mashiach come by force, so to speak, just impose himself on us, or we could at least be receptive to the idea, and then you're a keli for it.
See the
So the bottom line is, the point is integration. You're really asking, maybe another example I think may be helpful, that really can help the process. Remember there was the whole discussion how mind refines the midas. Mutve, murgish, muskel, ibr yanika meich. So you can ask the question, how does a child become a container? How does a child become a keli to doing something that's not selfish? A child is born, remember the selfishness of a child is not the selfishness of an adult. But a child is self-absorbed. And it's necessary. A baby is to eat, it's to sleep. That's how God wants it. So how does a child grow into an adult? So you could say, you know what? It's a magical thing. God just forces the child to become an adult. No. God gave us a mind. The mind trains the midas to become less selfish. And this is a process. Remember the 3 steps he talked about. So this is, in different words, how the keli is trained to become more receptive to the air. But
and
here,
vice versa, the air is receptive.
Yeah, for sure. But here, he's really talking about the dynamics of where these two ultimately meet.
Yeah.
Another example would be when a teacher teaches a student. So in the beginning, the student is a beginner. A beginner means his mind is not a container yet for all the ideas that are taught. So he starts teaching A, B, C. Someone asks the question, how do you get from Aleph, Beis, Gimel to learning Ayin Beis, which is all about letters? Perhaps you don't jump from grade 1 to learn Ayin Beis. You learn Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Then you learn how to compose words. Then you learn how to compose sentences and ideas. Then you get a little older, you can abstract a bit. My point is, what you're really doing is you're taking a keli that began as a chemer gas, or unrefined mind. May have had the potential, but what you're doing is you're training a person to become more receptive to ideas. At some point, one point is the primus akeli of the child's mind is going to end up being the container to the chitzeni sa'er, and then it becomes a container to the etzem ha'er, etc., etc. But I think you'll get it more when he concludes. See, this is all. You have to remember, this is a very slow development, and around 20 pages from now, he brings it all back together, and it's all a bunch of pieces of a puzzle. What he's going to bring back together is where Eir and Keli, you're going to see, he's going to speak about 4 different ways where Eir and Keli do not meet, in order to contrast, to say how it does meet. Like in other words, if the Eir is too much Eir, or the Keli is too much Keli, they're not going to meet. If the Keli is too much Eir, and the Eir is too much Keli, they're also not going to meet. Instead, you need to have a perfect balance, because if the flame becomes the wick, you ever see when you light a flame, sometimes the oil and the wick is so strong, it puts out the flame. If the flame is so dominant and the wick is not there, it's also not going to work. So it's that perfect balance, that's the challenge.
Shnaim Shein Arba seems to be pretty pervasive.
Yeah. And look, at the end of it, it's going to end up being, the bottom line is this is a model for Aveda, for sure. This is a model of how we can refine a yesh and train it on its terms to become more receptive to that which is not yesh. Now, we don't need to elaborate on the yesh. We all know quite well, right? You look in the mirror. Some people some Chassidim never looked in the mirror, never saw a picture of themselves because they didn't want to see the yesh. They say, I know of it all the time. I don't need to look at it all the time.
Your wife will tell you anyway.
You just remind me of the story about this guy, the guy Chelim. He never saw a mirror before. So he goes out, he finds a mirror. He looks at the mirror, he says, Mama's my grandfather. He says, I'm going to save this. I want to have a picture of my grandfather. He looks out, I can't believe it. He brings it home, puts it up on the shelf, and whenever he needs to remind himself of his grandfather, he takes the mirror down. His wife sees him sneaking there all the time. She's wondering, what is this? So she looks at it. She says, she sees a woman. She says, what? There's another woman in his life? No. She starts yelling at him. She says, what are you talking about? She said, let me see. She says, no, it's my grandfather. She says, what are you doing? Anyway, they go to the Rav, and she's telling him that he has another woman picture on the shelf in the house. And he's saying, he knows what she's talking about. So the Rav says, bring the picture here. They bring the mirror to him. He looks at it, he says, you're both crazy. It's the Rav. Anyway. You can learn psychological lessons from this, right? Alazan Zich.
The way she likes that.
They say the old Belzer Rebbe never saw a picture of himself and never looked in the mirror. And they showed him, he was a Heilige, he's the story with the Rebbe, with the glove, yeah. So they showed him a picture of him once, and he said a Heilige. He never saw it before. Was like Rab Nissen. He used to speak against Marozhina. He shouldn't eat ice cream. Rab Nissen Nemanov used to say not to eat ice cream. One by a wedding, he's eating ice cream. So someone says, Rab Nissen, is that doch nicht essen? He says, das ist Marozhina. He didn't know this was ice cream. You know, it's not to be eaten by people who know it's a taiva. They gave him something to eat. Huh? Well, not on that level.
Garbage, it's part of the garbage, that's why he ate it.
Okay.
We need to realize.
Look, I think this is this can be turned into models of, I think, corporate models, working together with people, mediation, relationships, shalom bayis, definitely related to children. This is a tremendous formula here of how you get two things that are opposites to meet. Even community harmony. But you have to understand the problem first. You can't begin by saying, you know what, like the Rabbi used to say, there's three sides to every war. There's two people fighting, and the third one is a Reid of Shalom. He's chasing away the peace. He says, let's make all peace, and he causes more war. He's the peacemaker. So you have to have, obviously, bittul, but there's ways. You have to find on the terms of the yesh and the terms of the ayin, how they each can learn to communicate and so on. We talked about it back then. Remember the whole thing with Zdaim, when we spoke about his kaulus. It's all connected. Both the two stages. One is tolerating one another, step one, and number two is actually working with one another, understanding we complement each other. Look, let's be honest. The biggest problem of the yesh is that it's insecure. And being it's insecure, it refuses to want to accept another approach. Because it's like, if I agree with you, I become less. And there's a certain insecurity in that, and that fear is what doesn't let, there's a big factor, I think, in a lot of the difficulties. And obviously this can, once it begins to fester and grows, it grows into a monster. But it begins with, why can't two people just sit down and figure out? So, one reason people say is because each one thinks, I'm so right, and God is on my side, there's no way. But I think it's more about, insecurity and fear, as I find, in most cases. It's not conscious. It's not like fear as in trembling. It's a certain thing people who've been hurt. They don't trust. If I give in, maybe I'll be taken advantage of. There's a lot of things. Remember, you have to always go to the root of a problem. The root of a problem didn't begin in war. The root always begins with small little things. But if you go there, you'll always find there's that type of... And everybody then becomes very self-contained. Nobody understands me. Nobody gets it. And therefore, Of course, there's always malicious people and stuff like that, but nobody's born malicious. So you have to wonder why do some people can coexist with others and why can't others cannot? We went through the Stein personality.
It's so funny because I was thinking before you smiled what you were thinking about it.
But it's a nationality.
You're obsessed,
You're obsessed.
Why do we both
I don't know.
Do we have similar experiences?
Rabbi Simon, it's really a nationality. If you look at a Messianic Yid, he gets along with everybody.
Because he doesn't stand for anything, that's why.
Well, your wife's pushing.
You gotta get along with them before you get your pocket.
I think it's a lot of the Russian person, it's all different
Listen, you're not going to get away with this thing you keep on telling me it's like the leopard can't change its spots. It's not an excuse, Meshach. Du musst dich einschalten. No, you always keep going back. There's the Russian thing.
You touched on two people not getting along.
First of all, there's no such thing as predestined machlekes. That's chas v'shalom. To say because they're Russians, that's what they have to fight? I don't think so. You could say their personality makes it difficult.
Different personalities get on the fire differently than whatever.
The Alter Rebbe was a Russian,
Right.
as much Russian as you and I.
Yeah,
He
right.
comes out of prison
Right.
and has all the legitimate right to be upset at what they did there.
Right.
Massacred him.
Right.
He sat there with the misnagid for 3 hours,
Right.
took all the abuse, And then he writes in Ketenti, Geras HaKedesh too, that Ketenti Mekol HaChasadim, I'm humbled by all the Chasadim. And Chaz v'Shalom, we should not gloat
Right.
and say, you see, who's right? Okay, you say as a tzaddik, as a rebbe, verstehe. But my point is, we were taught this is the method. I'm Russian blood just as you have.
100%.
But to say that that's...
I want to give you a 30-second gig. I went into an office last week.
And by the way, Russians don't have a monopoly on machlekes, for the record.
That's correct.
A nice piece of it though.
But
But Hungarians can't fight.
And how?
The whole world is at war. What are you telling me? Every culture has its thing. The point I'm trying to make is,
Well, if I bring
the
Thursday
Lech
night
Chassidus-
on the allergy.
no, the Lech Chassidus,
Bring it Thursday night, I didn't know.
Why not?
Okay.
Like if I bring it. I think that Rabbi Jacobson should bring every Thursday night with us and bring in all the.
what's wrong with
young
Sunday
boys.
morning?
What?
This is a shtickle verbringen too.
Yeah.
Okay, we have definitely an
Yeah.
innovation.
I'm gonna send it
Well, let's see what's on it. Yeah, we can go a little more. Okay, so now starts a new discussion here. Not new, but he's going to now, a new little chapter. Remember one thing. This is not one mimer where you begin and end and it's over. Look at this. It's all one flow. The film isn't over until it's over. And this is one volume. There's another volume that's just as big as this, bigger than this. And then there's a third volume. And the third volume wasn't even finished. Okay? Now, I haven't learned it all the way we're learning now, but I've been browsing just to see the picture. Honestly, it's emerging. I know the interface is definitely the underlying thing.
When you say it wasn't finished, you mean that Rabbi Shad never finished, or we never finished printing it out?
No, he never finished writing. And he went to, they say, he wrote almost to the end of the Messias.